election campaign. Now, of course, elections can be invigorating, but also bruising events. So let me congratulate all those candidates last night who won, but also commiserate with those who lost seats. Despite the hard-fought nature of this election campaign, I believe and I hope that we can, in Scotland, now agree on two fundamental points. Firstly, it is now clear beyond any doubt that the overwhelming majority of people in Scotland do want to remain in the European Union. The second question is whether a Brexit vote will mean a second independence referendum. Well, here's what the SNP manifesto at the recent election said about that. The Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the European Union against our will. Now, I'm clear that if Scotland does indeed face that prospect of being taken out of Europe against our will, then that option is on the table. But to be clear, that situation only arises if Scotland votes Remain next week. If Scotland votes to leave, then that premise for independence doesn't arise. If Scotland votes to leave, then that premise for independence doesn't arise. If Scotland votes to leave, then that premise for independence doesn't arise. That verdict was first delivered in the referendum in 2016. But if you're basing your decision on what it means for independence, let me be very, very clear. The only sensible and logical vote is one for Scotland to remain in Europe. Now, I'm clear that if Scotland does indeed face that prospect of being taken out of Europe against our will, then that option is on the table. But to be clear, that situation only arises if Scotland votes Remain next week.
The thing that was clear in 2016, when 62% of Scotland voted to remain, was that a good portion, if not all, wished for a second independence referendum. What was unclear was how many of those people voted to remain because they wished to remain in the EU. And the same thing is apparent now. What remains very clear is that there is still a desire for a second independence referendum. What remains relatively unclear is how many of the people that voted for the SNP did so because they wished to remain in Europe. But that doesn't stop Thin Lips still doing what she does best. Misleading, manipulating and deceiving.
The verdict was first delivered in the referendum in 2016. It was reinforced in the general election of 2017.
The 2017 election. In 2017 general election, where the SNP lost a third of their seats amid Tory surge, losing 21 to be precise, I'd hardly say that constitutes clear desire to remain in Europe.
That verdict was first delivered in the referendum in 2016. It was reinforced in the general election of 2017. It was strengthened in the European election earlier this year.
Where Thin Lips came out to reassure unionists that a vote for the SNP was not a vote for independence, only to come out after the results and say that the increase in seats strengthened their case for independence. Now the point, of course, is again that a good portion of the people that would have voted for the SNP in that election would have done so because they wanted independence. What's not so clear is how many voted for them because they wished to remain in Europe. But being disingenuous and taking people's votes and using them to argue a different point is something that re-emerged in the run-up to this election as well. With Thin Lips coming out the other day to insist that a vote for the SNP did not need to be a vote in favour of independence, urging no voters and those undecided on the independence question to back the party if they wanted to stop Brexit and stop the Tories, adding, "My message is that I don't take their support for the SNP as necessarily support for independence," only to now imply that the majority of seats that they obtained is now somehow a mandate for a second independence referendum. Wow.
Was emphatically confirmed. Westminster has ignored people in Scotland for more than 3 years.
Ignored people in Scotland. You ignored all the people that wanted a second independence referendum by putting it on the back burner and choosing to prioritise stopping Brexit for the whole of the UK instead. You also ignored the people in Scotland that voted to leave the European Union. Not once have you brought them up, not once have you taken them into consideration. Instead, you've done everything in your power to stop Brexit. And now that you have failed to a degree, you're now falling back and exploiting independence. All of a sudden it's no longer on the back burner. All of a sudden you give a shit. And you're exploiting these people. You're exploiting their desire so you can get what you want.
Said enough. It is time for Boris Johnson to start listening. I accept, regretfully, that he has a mandate for Brexit in England, but he has no mandate whatsoever to take Scotland out of the European Union.
He doesn't require a standalone mandate. He's Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Second of all, if you were to obtain a referendum right now on independence and Scotland voted to leave the UK, you still have to leave Europe. I fail to see the difference between having to leave in the back of a referendum win and that, or to that I should say, of being taken out as part of the UK. There is no difference. There isn't a scenario possible where Scotland can remain in the European Union. Every outcome, bar stopping Brexit and not having a second independence referendum, results in Scotland having to leave the EU.
Ahead, he will drive a coach and horses through the very idea that is supposed to underpin the UK, the idea that the Union is a partnership of equal nations. And that brings into very sharp relief the second fundamental principle that I believe we in Scotland can unite around, that Scotland's future must be in Scotland's hands. Now, I acknowledge that not absolutely everyone who voted SNP yesterday is ready to support independence. But the point of unity that I do believe exists is this one. Whether or not Scotland becomes an independent country must be a matter for the people who live here.
A party spending the best part of 3 years trying to prevent the UK from leaving the EU is the only reason that the much anticipated IndyRef quote-unquote 2 hasn't come to fruition as of yet. Every setback we've had to endure, whether that be the People's Vote campaigns, the joint efforts to block no deal, the never-ending court cases, or their role in trying to force additional extension requests every time they had the opportunity to, in the end, only served to delay the circumstantial change required in order to bring about a second independence referendum.
Not a decision for any Westminster Prime Minister, and certainly not for one who suffered a crushing defeat in Scotland last night. The Tories fought this campaign in Scotland on a single issue. They spoke, quite literally, about nothing else.
That's rich coming from you, is it not?
They bombarded people in Scotland with the same relentless message day after day and night after night. They said that a vote for them was a vote to deny people in Scotland the right to decide our own future.
Said a vote for you was a right to choose our own future, quote unquote. And yet here we are.
Well, yesterday, the people of Scotland decided instead to reject the Tories. The stunning election win last night for the SNP renews, reinforces and strengthens the mandate we have from previous elections to offer the people of Scotland a choice over their future.
But there hasn't been any circumstantial change. We haven't left the European Union. The SNP have been trying to do up until this point is obtain a referendum, despite the fact that they haven't met the criteria for said referendum. Lips can't afford for the people of Scotland to realise that the only reason they're not going to see an independence referendum potentially is because she chose to prioritise stopping Brexit for the whole of the UK instead of allowing the process to run its course in order for her to wait for the so-called circumstantial change. She's been hoping for what a good portion of her campaign jargon was predicated on was a hung parliament and or a Labour minority government, both of which would have allowed her to obtain a referendum. They don't have the right to hold a second independence referendum. They haven't met the criteria.
It says that it is for the Scottish Parliament, not a Westminster government, to decide whether and when there should be a new referendum on independence. So given the verdict of the people of Scotland last night, the Scottish Government will next week publish the detailed democratic case for a transfer of power to enable a referendum to be put beyond legal challenge. I have been clear that a referendum must be the responsibility of the Scottish Parliament. This is not about asking Boris Johnson or any other Westminster politician for permission. It is instead an assertion of the democratic right of the people of Scotland to determine our own future.
That's cute. The People's Vote campaigns, etc., etc. Constantly arguing for a second referendum, and only because she's been unsuccessful in stopping Brexit completely, she's now trying to turn her attention to a second independence referendum. The audacity to use words such as democratic. You can sit there all day long and repeat the trope of Scotland having the right to choose its own future, but that is all predicated on a mandate. Substantial change that has not yet come to fruition, and you are at fault for that.
And what I fear a Tory government now has in store for Scotland, that right to choose our own future, has never been more important or more urgent. So to the Prime Minister, let me be very clear. This is not simply a demand that I or the SNP are making. It is the right of the people of Scotland. And you, as the leader of a defeated party in Scotland, have no right to stand in the way. In an independent Scotland, we will always get the governments we vote for.
Before we go back into Europe.
Control of the powers and the levers needed to build a truly fair and a more prosperous country. We can take our place as an equal partner with our closest friends in the rest of the UK and across Europe and the world.
Buck up, you insufferable cow.